أبنائي وبناتي طلبة المرحلة الرابعة السلام عليكم. The lecture of today will be on measures of risk of disease. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to describe association and risk for disease, and you can list the different measures of risk, determining if the exposure is associated with disease through analyzing some epidemiological studies. Association refers to statistical relationship between two variables, while risk means the probability, possibility of occurrence or likelihood to get the disease with time. You can see a photo of a healthy lung compared to a photo of lung cancer, together with the smoking status. The question is there risk of smoking on lung cancer? To answer this question, you have to know how to plot the 2x2 table, in which you put the disease status on the top and the exposure status on the left. So we will get 4 cells. Cell A and B are the diseased exposed and healthy exposed, while cell C and D are the diseased unexposed and healthy unexposed. In cohort studies, as you have studied, we can measure the incidence of disease through the following formula, where the incidence equals to number of new cases of disease divided by population at risk multiplied by a constant. Now, to apply this formula, if we want to find the incidence of disease among exposed, it will be equal to diseased exposed divided by the total exposed, which means incidence of exposed equals to A divided by A plus B and then multiplied by a constant. Similarly, we can measure the incidence among unexposed, which is equal to C, the diseased in the unexposed group, divided by the total unexposed, C divided by C plus D multiplied by a constant. Now, when we want to compare disease incidence, for example, the incidence of lung cancer among smokers tells us how much smokers are at risk of getting cancer. But this is absolute measure. It does not give us real idea about the risk of smoking itself. So we need to compare the incidence of lung cancer among smokers with the incidence of lung cancer among non-smokers. Studies have shown that incidence of lung cancer among smokers is 9 times more. What does this mean? It means that smokers are 9 times more likely to get lung cancer than non-smokers. Now I will go quickly on the different measures of risk. We have got absolute measures, relative measures, and attributable measures of risk. Of the absolute measures is the incidence rate. Of the relative measures is the relative risk and odds ratio. And of the attributable measures is attributable risk and attributable risk percent. The question is how to measure risk. Let's answer this question by taking a solved problem. 8,000 healthy employers were asked about smoking. 3,000 of them were smokers. All the employers were followed up for 5 years. After that, we get 84 smokers and 55 non-smokers developed heart disease. The next step, we will plot the numbers from the problem on the 2 by 2 table, as you can see here. The total number of employers, 8,000. 3,000 were smokers. After 5 years of the smokers, we get 84 cases of heart disease, and also heart disease developed among non-smokers. 55 non-smokers also got heart disease after 5 years. Since this is a cohort study, because we have followed up the sample for time, long time, waiting for development of disease, we have started with exposure, ending with disease, so we can measure incidence. Incidence, according to the formula I have just mentioned in the previous slides, will be equal to A divided by A plus B. This is the incidence among exposed, which will be 28 per thousand. And the incidence of disease among non-smokers will be the non-smokers cases, 55, divided by the total. I mean C divided by C plus D, multiplied by a constant, which is here. We have selected 1,000. The answer is 11 per thousand. Please remember those two numbers. To start with the relative risk measures, we have the relative risk, RR. It is also called risk ratio, so it is a ratio. This RR indicates the likelihood of getting the disease in the exposed relatively compared to the unexposed group. It measures the strength of association between exposure and disease. This is important in the causation and in the prevention programs. RR is a ratio equals to incidence rate among exposed divided by incidence rate among non-exposed. Returning back to our example, if we divide the incidence to get the relative risk, it will be equal to 28 divided by 11 equals to 2.5. What does this mean? It means that smokers are 2.5 times more at risk of getting heart disease than non-smokers. Since the relative risk is a ratio, it can be more than 1, indicating the positive effect of exposure. The exposure increases the disease. It can be 1, which means there is no effect of exposure on development of disease. And it can be less than 1. And here, the exposure have got a preventive effect on development of disease. Now, taking the other measure of attributable risk, it is the attributable risk, AR. It can be called excess risk, AR, or risk difference. What does this mean? In this bar chart, you can see we have got two groups, the unexposed and the exposed. Now, the incidence of disease among the non-exposed is this. this incidence is not attributable to exposure because they are unexposed. This is the magnitude of disease among the unexposed. Now, what happens after exposure? After exposure, the incidence of disease increases. This increase is attributable to exposure. So we have got excess risk, excess incidence of disease attributable to exposure. So attributable risk is a risk excess. It is calculated by the difference between incidence rate among exposed minus incidence rate among non-exposed. As it is a difference, we may get attributable risk which is positive, indicating that exposure increases disease, or it may be zero, where the exposure gives no added risk for getting the disease. And sometimes it may be negative, and here the exposure is protective and disease is prevented by exposure. Returning back to our example, as you can see, this is the attributable risk calculated by the difference. 28 per thousand minus 11 per thousand equals to 17 per thousand. What does this mean? This means that 17 cases per thousand in the exposed population is attributed to smoking. Now, taking the other measure of attributable risk, which is the attributable risk percent. This refers to the proportion of disease in the exposed that can be prevented if we remove the exposure. We remove the exposure by, for example, application of a prevention program. Attributable risk percent equals to attributable risk divided by incidence rate among exposed percent. Going back to our example, the attributable risk percent equals to 17 per thousand, which is the attributable risk we have calculated, divided by incidence rate among exposed, which is 28 per thousand. The answer, the result is 61%. What does this mean? This means that 61% of disease can be prevented by application of anti-smoking program. Now, the last measure I want you to know is called odds ratio, OR. Now, in epidemiological studies, which are case control, we cannot get incidence. So, we cannot find out relative risk. So, how to measure risk here? It is measured by odds ratio. How can odds ratio be calculated? See this 2 by 2 table of a case control study. The cases are A and C, control is the B and D. And here is the factor present or absent among cases or controls. The equation is OR equals to AD divided by BC, and you can see on the table it is very easy to memorize. AD divided by BC. Since it is a ratio, it can be more than 1, meaning exposure increases the disease. Exposure is a risk factor, or it may be 1, so exposure is not a risk factor. Sometimes it can be less than 1, referring that the exposure is a protective factor for getting the disease. Taking an example to explain odds ratio, here you can see that we have selected 3,000 cases of known bladder cancer patients. In addition, we have selected 5,800 healthy controls. Both cases and controls were asked about past history of using artificial sweetener, which is saccharin, with their food. So all of them were divided into users and non-users. As you expect, this is a case control study. In this epidemiological study, we cannot find out incidence, so we cannot calculate relative risk. So we will measure risk by calculating odds ratio. According to the formula, odds ratio equals A multiplied by D divided by B multiplied by C. And you can see the answer equals to approximately 1. What does this mean? OR equals 1. This means that saccharin is not a risk factor for getting a blood cancer. By the end of this slide, we have finished the measures of risk. I hope you have enjoyed and understood the lecture. A specific practical session about risk will be there to highlight and solve problems on risk. Thank you.